At approximately the same time, rationalism emerges during the early modern period on the European continent. The 17th century works of the British philosophers Francis Bacon, John Locke, and Thomas Hobbes established a school of British empiricism that continues in the works of George Berkeley, David Hume, Harriet Taylor Mill, and John Stuart Mill. People often associate empiricism with these thinkers and time, though as with rationalism, one can find thinkers who espouse similar views both before and after this period. Aristotle, for instance, introduces the metaphor of a tabula rasa in On the Soul, a notion that's often associated with its use in Locke's writing. The Islamic philosopher Al-Farabi begins a tradition of thought around the notion of a tabula rasa as a model for the mind in Islamic philosophy, and that runs throughout the Islamic Golden Age. Empiricist ideas emerge during the late Italian Renaissance at the beginning of the 16th century in the works of thinkers like Machiavelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Galileo's father, Vincenzo Galilei. At the beginning of the 20th century, thinkers in Vienna and Berlin combine ideas from logic and mathematics with empiricist doctrines to formulate the movement called logical empiricism. Otto Neurath and Morris Slick pioneered this school of thought, while fellow Austrian Rudolf Carnap and Germans Karl Hempel and Hans Reichenbach, as well as British philosopher A.J. Ayer, further developed the view. Empiricists reject both of the principles associated with rationalism, claiming instead that all ideas come from experience, that is, there are no innate ideas, and hence all knowledge comes through the operations of the mind upon the ideas of experience, and this is what unites them. With our increased knowledge of the origins, central tenets, primary historical periods, and primary historical figures for both rationalism and empiricism, let's now turn our attention to Plato and look at those excerpts from the Republic. What we'll notice immediately is that Plato's metaphysics and epistemology are deeply, deeply intertwined. Plato will distinguish between three different cognitive states. We'll have knowledge with its highest epistemic status, we'll have opinion with an intermediate epistemic status, and we'll have ignorance with the lowest, really the non-existent epistemic status. Each of these states is related to an object that's responsible in part for the epistemic status of that state, together with a characteristic faculty that relates the mind to those objects. Once we've gone through those basic distinctions, then we'll turn our attention to the divided line on the one hand and the allegory of the cave and talk about how they are used by Plato to illustrate these basic ideas. In this first passage, the one that discusses the divided line, Plato is going to present an argument to the effect that there are three distinct cognitive states: knowledge, opinion, and ignorance. Each state arises from a distinct faculty and has a distinct corresponding object. Knowledge has as its object being or perfect existence. Ignorance has as its object non-being. And opinion, the intermediary between knowledge and ignorance, must have as its object something which is an intermediary between perfect being and non-being. The objects of knowledge are identified with the forms. They are immutable, unchangeable, and not subject to contradiction. Ignorance has nothing as its object. And finally, the objects of opinion are identified as the objects of sensation, that is, the particular instances of the form within the sensory realm. The arguments to establish the intermediary of particulars between being and non-being are pretty familiar to us if we've read any Plato. Particulars admit of contradictory properties and hence are not perfectly real. Now, Socrates and Plato in the dialogues will give many different versions of this kind of argument. There's versions that compare different objects, noting that an object in comparison to others has both one property and its contradictory property. So for example, he may pull up three lines, and then he may look at those lines and say, hey, look, that blue line is both shorter than the black line and longer than the green line. Hence, it is both long and short, admitting of a contradictory property. He might also talk about the property of an object as it changes through time, talking about how at one point a sommelier may have a glass of wine and find the wine to be delicious, and then a day or two later the sommelier who is sick may have a glass of that wine and find the wine to taste funny. Similarly, he'll talk about individuals having properties that are contradictory in their very nature. And so somebody like, I believe this is Lou Ferrigno, may be an example of some sort of idealized standard of male perfection, and yet for Plato, you'll find him pointing to difficulties that make him both handsome or an ideal male figure and not an ideal male figure. And similarly, I believe this is Cindy Crawford. She was a model in the 1980s who was so popular and famous and in demand that she was one of the models that resulted in their coining the term supermodel. But she was interesting relative to her being such a famous and in-demand model because she was quite beautiful, but also had that mole on her upper lip, which many people would have thought would have prevented her from being a model. So Plato would look at examples of this and say, see, we can see that objects exhibit both that property and its contradiction when they're in the sensory or sensible realm. When we turn our attention to the divided line itself, Plato uses it as an illustration. So he says, we can imagine the relationship between these different states and different objects by taking a line and dividing it in half. That major division is the division between the intelligible and the sensible. Within each of those divisions, we can divide that line again. And at the bottom of this divided line is what we would call imagination, the faculty that relates our minds to objects that correspond to ignorance. And in Plato's view, these are images or reflections of the objects of the sensible realm. Then we have the faculty of belief. The faculty of belief has as its corresponding object the objects of the sensible world. Since these objects are imperfect, the faculty of belief results in imperfect epistemic states. Next, we have the faculty of intelligence, and the faculty of intelligence represents this faculty that relates us to the forms, but with this intermediary use of the objects of the sensible realm, and hence gives us an imperfect knowledge of those perfect objects. And then finally, we have reason, which allows us to understand and relate to the ideas or forms in their perfection and perfect existence. We find a similar relationship being depicted in the allegory of the cave. In the allegory of the cave, we have our person starting off in the cave. The cave is lit to some degree, but the lighting is dim, and what the person sees in the first stage of the allegory of the cave corresponds to the objects of ignorance, the shadows on the wall, and so forth. And so our captive in the cave here might see a bird reflected against the wall from the fire. The next stage in the allegory of the cave is when this person frees themselves from those chains and is able to look out into the cave. Now the cave is still dark, and that doesn't mean that the person now is in a much better epistemic position, but they're in a position that roughly corresponds to what Plato conceives of as our epistemic situation in the sensible realm. And so we can see that person saying, now that I'm freed from my chains, I see that I confuse shadows with echoes of reality. So this person has a better position now once they're in the realm of the sensible, but they're still not capable of forming anything with greater epistemic merit than mere opinion. And together, these two realms constitute what Plato refers to as the world of opinion. Now, when the person leaves the cave and enters into the world of knowledge, then they enter into that first stage that corresponds to that third division in the divided line. Now here they're getting a sense of their relationship to the forms. They're using reason, but reason aided by sensible objects. And so in the allegory of the cave, we have the person saying things like, oh, though I cannot see with complete clarity, I see that there's a world beyond the cave. And this is the realm of sunlight. And finally, once the person adjusts to the realm of the world of knowledge, to the realm of the ideas, then they at last use reason to commune with the forms in their most perfect way, and that is when they achieve true knowledge. So we can see that for Plato, ideas and not sensation give rise to knowledge. And one achieves true knowledge by cultivating an acquaintance with the forms of worldly objects and not with the objects themselves. And in fact, our sensations prevent us from really achieving true knowledge. It's only through reason that we actually get in touch with the most perfect beings and hence achieve that cognitive state that has its highest epistemic merit.